When we think of Jesus, we're often smothered with images of peace, love, and kindness. But one moment in the Gospel of Matthew seems to flip that narrative right on its head. A Gentile mother begs Jesus to heal her daughter, and he responds by calling her a dog. Now, aside from the initial irony or even comedy of that moment, this verse has deeply troubled Christians and skeptics alike. Is there a dark side to Jesus? Does this verse prove that he is no more enlightened than his first century brethren? The answer to those questions not only addresses those few verses, it also answers the seemingly overwhelming wrath of God that seems to plague the Old Testament, and it also answers the problem of evil itself. These are big claims, I know, and though if you're a skeptic, you might not tend to find these resolutions satisfactory, I believe that within the Christian moral landscape, that this demonstration will most certainly bring clarity to what exactly Jesus was deliberately doing and what God's intention is. So how is it that the protagonist of kindness and mercy can be seen as so cruel and detached here? Why was the beloved Nazarene so dehumanizing to this poor, innocent woman? Well, here, as well as throughout the entire Bible, and really throughout most other forms of narrative literature, one must interpret what is going on based on context. I know this might seem like a cop-out, but we always consider context even in our own lives, with people, books, and stories. If we're talking with a friend, for instance, we might say something that fits the conversation on the outset, where in reality it actually references something else, like an inside joke. I love inside jokes. I'd love to be a part of one someday. Now, the principle of context when it comes to the Bible is no different. Now, if you're a skeptic, you could see this verse as a flaw in the so-called perfect Christ and thus refute Christianity. If you do this, though, you're relying on your interpretation, which assumes that there is nothing else going on here, other than the God-man himself calling some poor woman a dog. You might even show it to the relatives who are trying to convert you as a gotcha moment. But just like any other philosophy, it's far more admirable to actually understand what is going on here and build your argument against that. So when it comes to this verse, we need to understand what Jesus was saying, who he was saying it to, and why he was saying what he was saying. This might explain why Matthew decided to include this verse in his writings and not the many others that were lost in time. In this verse, Jesus is speaking to a Canaanite mother. Oftentimes, though, when Jesus talks to some members of a specific group of people, he's actually addressing the entire group. In the 23rd chapter of Matthew, for instance, he confronts the Pharisees and blames them for the murder of Abel and Zechariah. However, we know that Abel wasn't killed by the Pharisees. First of all, because that story happened thousands of years before their time, and secondly, because we know who killed Abel. Spoiler alert, it was Cain. So Christ isn't simply addressing the Pharisees, he's addressing their entire spiritual lineage. He's addressing everyone who has Cain's disposition. So you might raise another objection here. Well, if Jesus was addressing all the Canaanites when speaking to the woman, then he was definitely being racist, because he's lumping people of all sorts together as if they're all the same. Here's why that's not the only option. See, when Jesus addresses an entire people, whether through one individual or through a few, he's doing it knowing that his words will be echoed and heard by those in the future, like you and me. Let's expand that verse a little bit more. When the woman asks Jesus for help, he responds by saying, "Why give to dogs the bread which belongs to the children?" So there are two groups of people here. There's the dogs, being the Canaanites, and there's the children, being the Jews. And just to have a brief moment of etymological clarity here, the Greek word kynάριον means small household dog, like a puppy. In contrast, the Greek word κύων refers to a street dog. Now, going back to the verses here, there's two types of people present in this interaction. His disciples, who are the Jews, and the woman, who is a Canaanite. Now, if you're familiar with arguments against God's mercy, the name Canaanite should be ringing some bells. One of the favorite arguments of atheists is the reference to the book of Deuteronomy, in which God commands the Israelites to slaughter the Canaanites, saying, "You shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction." Seems odd for an all-loving God, doesn't it? Most people stop there. They point this out and say, "See? He's not an all-loving God. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done that. However, let's pretend that the Bible is all fiction and that some great writer wrote the whole thing. Are we not dying of curiosity as to what exactly the Canaanites did to merit this complete destruction? I certainly am. Well, it turns out the Canaanites were a bit wild. They engaged in incest, ritual mutilation, and even child sacrifice to demons. Practices so depraved that they shocked even the surrounding pagan cultures. So God basically said, okay, full stop here. And of course, ever since then, there has been tremendous friction between the Jews and the Canaanites, as well as between God and the Canaanites. But then comes Jesus, and the entire attitude between the race is about to go through some drastic changes. See, the Jewish attitude towards the Canaanites was that they were dogs, inferior, barely human, degenerated beings. And so when Christ says, "Why give to dogs the bread which belongs to the children?" he has the Jewish people's ear. They're listening to him. However, it is how this woman responds that allows the audience to realize what Jesus was after. See, it is this woman's response that finally puts to bed this feud and reconciles these lost children with their creator. For when Christ calls her a dog, the woman responds by saying yes, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Jesus' recognition of the Canaanite woman's faith and his healing of her daughter marks a profound shift. The long-standing estrangement between God and the Canaanites is broken, at least in part, through this act of grace. Though the full reconciliation of all peoples comes through his ultimate sacrifice, this moment reveals that God's mercy is no longer limited by ethnicity or past judgment. In a single sentence and a single miracle, Jesus rewrites 1,000 years of judgment, not by erasing the past, but by opening the door to a new kind of future, one where faith and not ancestry defines belonging. Okay, fine, but how does this resolve anything substantial? It may resolve some tension that's happening within the biblical narrative, but how does this address the actual problem of evil that seems to exist beyond the lines of Scripture? Well, you might find it interesting that the first who have wrestled with this question were the earliest Jews. See, because of the nature of monotheism, Jewish people quickly realized that everything that exists comes from one single God, including evil. They couldn't shift blame to other gods because, well, there were none. When it comes to answering for the atrocities that plagued civilizations, the buck stopped with He who is. It wasn't until a man named Jesus Sirach, who in the book of Sirach addresses this burning question. After a dense, philosophically rich analysis on creation and early Jewish thought, Sirach determines that spiritual suffering stems from the disobedience to God and the refusal to align one's will to His. In fact, the entire set of wisdom books, from Job to Ecclesiastes, unearth this burning question and wrestle with the haunting thought that suffering stems not from physical tribulation, but from spiritual dissonance. Kierkegaard, a more contemporary thinker, thoroughly expands on this and, through a series of carefully crafted recursive expositions, brings light to this phenomenon. When it comes to the Canaanites, as well as all of us who stray and in some instances directly oppose this so-called will of God, a swift death is often considered a mercy. Often us humans in a sobering moment will take our own lives when we realize the wreckage we have created. Even from our own determination, we often think of death as mercy. In fact, the phrase, "put him out of his misery," is almost exclusively used to promote the killing of a suffering being. In some instances, it is better to die than to keep witnessing our own spiritual degeneration. Though in Jewish and in Christian tradition, it is only God that can make such a decision. And He does indeed make it. What Christ does here with this woman is radically different. Jesus, with the help of this Canaanite mother, demonstrates that at any point, whether one stumbles briefly or is in the darkest depths of the spiritual abyss, like the Canaanites were, it is faith and dog-like obedience to God that can rip one out of that stage and bring you back into spiritual healing. Now, I know that if this video reaches a learned audience, it will get ripped to shreds. I know that my understanding of the depth of psychological suffering is limited only to what I've experienced. And I know that though some psychological suffering is indeed well-deserved, that's not necessarily the case for others. And so for me to universalize despair and agony to a simple equation is of course reductionistic and risks undermining those who are deeply wounded not through their own actions, but through the deeds of others. I understand that this level of analysis is barely scraping the surface of the complexities of human suffering, though I hope that what I'm saying does not come across as a clean, overarching answer to a universal problem, but as a small spot of light into a different way of understanding the Christian epistemology. I have much more to say, but for now, I'll end it there. This is Logos and Mythos. Thank you for watching.